If you're watching this, you probably find Romance language sound shifts very interesting, and I do too. But my favorite type are when Romance language sound shifts are pretty much the same across the Romance languages. That is to say, from Latin to modern Romance, they've changed almost uniformly. But if you have ever harbored the opinion that French, amongst the Romance languages, is kind of a strange exception, then watch this video, because today we're going to cover a phonological, concrete, historical reason why you might have that opinion. Now, to start off, obviously, as you will have recognized on this channel, when I talk about Romance languages, I'm usually referring to French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. I would love to include others like Catalan, Sardinian, Sicilian, Neapolitan, all of them. The problem, however, is that those first four are the first four I'm most comfortable with, and I don't want to make mistakes in any of these other languages. So if you are upset that you don't see Romanian a lot here, well, that's the reason why. I don't want to butcher a language you care about. Having said that, one of the important features of Latin that we need to look at to understand this video is that Latin had something called phonemic vowel length. And what that essentially means is Latin had two features to its vowels. The first feature was that every vowel was short or long. So in the five vowels, A, E, I, O, U in English, there would be two forms. There would be A and A, I and I, E and E, and so on and so forth. And this is called phonemic because that vowel length actually had a semantic difference. That is to say, it made a difference in meaning in the words. A good example of this would be the Latin word for evil. That's malum, with a short A vowel. But if you say malum, you mean apple. Another great example is liber means child in Latin, but liber means book. So Latin had this feature, but importantly, as Latin was evolving over the centuries and towards the end of the classical period and towards the end of the Roman Empire, we know that that distinction in vowel length started to fall away. Those weren't considered short and long versions of the same vowel. They came to be interpreted more or less as two separate kind of vowels in the first place. And what we see then is the process in early Romance of a phenomenon called merging, where some Latin short vowels or long vowels were adopted into the vowel qualities of other vowels. Now, to make this concrete, I want to give the example that I'm looking at today, because there's a really curious thing that occurs between Latin and Romance languages. And if you speak English, you can find some pretty interesting comparisons here. So, in Latin, the tendency was that short I vowels became E in modern Romance. Look at the following pattern. Piscis or piscis in Latin meant fish. And in Spanish, we have pez or pescado in the sense of fish that you eat, fish as a culinary item. In Italian, you have pesce. The Latin verb to send mitere became mettere in Italian, meter in Spanish, meter in Portuguese, and mettre in French. There is a small change in meaning there, by the way. Bibere in Latin meant to send something. It could mean to send someone off to do something. That's actually where we get the English mission from. It's interesting there that actually the English mission, or a missive in English, conserves the E, whereas that became E in the Romance languages. Latin littera became Italian lettera, Spanish letra, Portuguese letra, and French lettre. So that seems like a pretty clearly established pattern. Whenever we see a short I in Latin, we then need to change that to an E in modern Romance. But as is always the case, it's actually not that simple. And this is where French gets really interesting. Because look at the following examples. The Latin word for the fruit, pear, pera, became pera in Italian, pera in Spanish, but poire in French. Fidem for faith, fe in Spanish, fede in Italian, but foi in French. Bibere, beber, bere, but boire. To see in Latin is videre, but in Spanish it's ver, Portuguese ver, Italian vedere, but in French you can complete the sentence here, voir. So what's going on here? Firstly, what's going on in that I to E change? And why is French taking a different path? Well, here's where we have to delve into a few hypotheses. And what I think essentially happened is that that short Latin I already is very close to being an open vowel anyway. Now, the distinction in phonetics between a closed and open vowel is pretty simple. It's all to do with the position of the tongue. If your tongue closes off your airway, then you're talking about a closed vowel. If you think about something like I, if I pronounce I very far like liber, you can see that the tongue almost closes off the mouth. It almost touches the roof of your mouth. Whereas E or A, those are pronounced with the tongue almost in a flat position. Now, yes, that might be the case if I'm using the long Latin I vowel, liber, for example. But if I'm saying just liber, I'm much closer to an open vowel anyway. Do this exercise quickly at home. Say mitere and then say mettere. Very quickly, mitere, mettere. You can see that I, e, mitere, mettere are pretty close in tongue position. And I think that similarity in tongue position over time lended itself to being confused for an open vowel in general. And that's where we get this I to E transition from late Latin to early Romance. There might be some other interesting causes, but I've thought about them and looked through some sources, and I couldn't find any causes in something as simple as stress or surrounding consonants or vowels. That doesn't seem to have great explanatory power, but if you know better than me, you know what to do. Just write in the comments and correct me there. Now let's turn to French. Why is French so weird in this case? And it actually seems to be close to something we looked at in a previous video on Spanish and Portuguese. Now, if you remember in that video, I mentioned how Spanish and Portuguese had this tendency to take unvoiced intervocalic consonants in Latin and make them voiced. So for this reason, vita in Latin or vita became vida in Spanish and vida in Portuguese. But in those cases when Latin already had a voiced intervocalic consonant, for example, the d in credere, Spanish and Portuguese tended to eliminate that. It became creer or creer in Portuguese and Spanish, respectively. Now, it seems to me that French took that same tendency, but to a much greater degree, and it occurred considerably earlier in French. If we look at some attested forms, we can tell that this diphthongisation that we see in examples like foi is already evident in the late 12th century in some instances. But why does it develop? And I think to do that, we just have to look at the Latin and we have to look at what's going on here. Look at a noun like fidem and eliminate the d. Suddenly it goes from fidem to being something like fie. Okay, we would assume that already the nasalized consonant m dropped out considerably before. So we go from fidem to fide, and then maybe from fide to fie. And when you move from that fide to fie, you've already undergone diphthongization. Two vowels that were previously separate are now together, they're next to each other. And maybe from there, all you need is a simple vowel shift to shift that fie to foi. And maybe that's what's going on with bibere. Bibere might have been something like bibere, bière, and then boire. Now, I don't know enough about the particular vowel shift that I would assume took place in French there. If you know more, again, please let me know in the comments below. But this is very much where my understanding of this particular French pattern ends. But I don't want to leave you on that, as interesting as it is, because there are some interesting instances where this I to E transition from late Latin to early Romance actually never occurred. One example would be how in Italian, literature is letteratura, but in Spanish it's literatura. And in Portuguese, it's also literatura. Portuguese and Spanish conserve the E in that case. I think this is probably because those are learned words that are reintroduced into the language at a later stage, and there's much more conscious Latinization going on when those words are reintroduced into the lexis. There are others that are a bit more difficult to explain. For example, why does the Latin word for vice, vitium or vitium, become vicio in Spanish and vizio in Italian? Why do they retain that? And that's a question that I have to leave open for now. Hopefully, I'll be able to find out why and make a subsequent video on that. But if you also know a little bit more than me about that, let me know in the comments, because I always like learning from you there. Until I get to read and answer your comments. I'm going to say thank you very much for watching the video. I always appreciate your contribution, and I will see you in the next one. Au revoir, adios, arrivederci, and adeus.